Today's class will be very long because today is just about talking about the exam review. Discussion number 9, the last one, is due this week. So we'll go over that a little bit, and then we will also talk about the paper a little bit, and just sort of like odds and ends, that kind of thing. And then I'll do like the intro to, good morning. We'll do the intro to 20th century literature. So as you can see, I have behind me an image to represent the new unit that we're going into, which is 20th century. 20th century starts off with World War I. So the literature gets a little bit heavy and depressing because of the influence of that war. And then on its heels comes World War II. So, modernism, as we'll talk about today, is not the most uplifting time period, but we'll go through that. I have a PowerPoint for you. Let me share my screen here. Let me start over in Blackboard. The new unit is there. So if you go to course content, the final unit, unit 6, is present right here. There's an introduction. You should read all that stuff. Objectives for the unit include things like connecting the literature of the 20th century to, the larger literary tradition, looking at modernism, postmodernism. But like I said, I don't think we're going to get to contemporary literature as it sort of suggests there. But it just says as time permits, so I guess I'm okay with that. Explain the connection of works, talked about that. Articulate responses to specific questions. That's for your discussions, but there's not a discussion for this unit. I took it out. Articulate main ideas in a given text, explain literary devices, all those things that are MLA guidelines that are usually on there. There are only 2 assignments in this unit, essay number 2 and the final exam. So discussion number 9, which is this week, the post is due on Friday. That one is the last one. There won't be any more. It's just going to start to conflict with the paper, which is due in a week, and the exam, which starts in 2 weeks. So I took that out. Readings. So the readings for this unit, today I'm just going to do the overview of 20th century modernism, postmodernism, and then on Thursday, I will talk about poetry. So here are the poetry selections for Thursday. They're all quite short, so hopefully you'll have a chance to look at them. Obviously, the goal on that day will be to point out the qualities of 20th century literature as they appear in those poems. I did make a PDF of the poetry selections right here, so if you just want to read the ones that are assigned, then you can get a PDF right there of these particular pages from the text. Otherwise, the texts are there. Then next week, Tuesday, is a discussion of Virginia Woolf's The Mark on the Wall. And Thursday, we will talk about Catherine Mansfield's The Garden Party. The Garden Party is a little bit longer than The Mark on the Wall. And then pretty much that's going to wrap up our course. We do have Friday next week, into May. We do have Friday next week, so that if we need to review, talk about the exam, maybe by then you'll have looked at the exam study guide and you might have questions for me, things you want me to talk about, or ways that things might appear on the exam. Or maybe we'll need to continue talking about the garden party on that day next week, but that will wrap it up. May 7th will be our last class day. That's next Friday. So after that, it's just going to be up to you to finish the final exam, and then it'll be up to me to grade it. So the term ends on the 14th. I do not expect you to come to class or do anything for class after the 7th, except the final exam. So when you're done with the final exam, there aren't going to be formatives. This week of the 17th, the week of the 24th, school's still going to be happening here, but I don't see the point of continuing with the course if the grades for STC are due on the 17th. So I'll just mark you present, and that will be it until the end of the term. So we don't have that much farther to go together, just about 2 weeks. So let's go back to this. So you do have some notes on modernism. I'm going to touch on that briefly in my overview today. And then you also have some notes on postmodernism that the department has set up for you. Here's where you can submit essay number 2. That is due a week from today. So that's the research paper. I have been working with people who are having trouble getting sources. And just let me say that in general, what I'm noticing is that people who are having trouble finding sources are people who don't have specific thesis in mind. It's backwards to search for sources before you know what your paper's about. So you should be looking at the 3 options, deciding what, like, period of time or author or piece that you want to work on for your research, and then you should write a thesis statement. And then you should be searching based on keywords in your thesis statement. What I'm getting for some people is they'll say, oh, I think I want to write about Shakespeare. Can you help me find some sources? Well, there are millions of articles about Shakespeare, of course. So the thing is, you need to refine that a little bit. You need to say that particular, if you're writing about an author, the question is, how did that author contribute to the language, to the literature, as it was building through time? So that limits you a little bit. So I would do searches like, Shakespeare contributions to literature, or consequences of Shakespeare's work, kind of like change up the words that you're using as you're searching JSTOR. There's also another, I don't know if you noticed, but, oh, okay. I'll have to fix that link, I guess. On this essay number 2 assignment sheet, there are some resources for you if you're going to do time periods, but also they'll be helpful if you're studying an author within a time period. So say you were going to study the work of Shakespeare and the effect that it's had on literature, English literature and language, then I would go to Voice of the Shuttle is a scholarly source. It's on the web. You need a minimum of 3 JSTOR articles, but you can also use the web for the other 2. There are 5 required sources for this paper. So I would go to this link here in Voice of the Shuttle, and you will see that they have tons of websites. These aren't even articles. Some of them are articles, but some of them are other websites where you can go and find scholarly articles. Here's where you have a list of authors. These are all Renaissance and 17th century. So obviously Shakespeare is going to be on this list down here under S. And so I could find, this is all about Shakespeare right here. Obviously festivals are not going to work for you, but you could look through some of these sources and see what you might find article wise. Likewise, you can do a JSTOR search if you're having trouble finding information on JSTOR for your topic, because you do need to have 3 JSTOR articles used in your paper. Just send me an email with your thesis statement and I will try to find 1 or 2 for you. Usually it's because you haven't refined your search on JSTOR, and JSTOR is going to return like anywhere the word Shakespeare exists in an article, which is 50,000 articles. So that's a lot to wade through. So if you focus it on Shakespeare's contribution, Shakespeare's effect on literature, things like that. Kind of like change up the wording a little bit a couple times. You should start to find information on JSTOR. But I've been helping people out. People have been emailing me and asking me, I've got all my sources, except I need to find one more. These are the ones I have, and then I can help you search for another possible source. I'm not going to read the article for you and give you a report on it, but I can point you in some directions. So you can definitely do that. But here's where you will submit it by next Tuesday. The reason I need them next Tuesday is because it's the last week of class and I need to grade them all, because then will come the exam and the following week. So. Here is the study guide for the final exam. I also put it on the calendar, but let's look at it. I did reduce the number of questions that the final exam has. It was set up to be longer than the midterm from the department. So I just sort of reduced from 15 short answer questions, I went down to 10, and from 5 essays, I went down to 3. So hopefully that will help you overall. But the midterm is, the final exam is set up, just like the midterm. And so it will open on May 10th and it will close on Thursday, May 13th, because then that gives me 3 days or so to read them all. If you are worried about your internet connection, you can certainly come up to school. We can find a location that works for you if you want to have a more stable internet connection to do your exam. It is set up to be done in one setting, but it's not timed, just like the previous one. So the short answer ones, I think on the midterm, people who lost points on the short answers mainly did because they weren't long enough. I got some responses on the short answers that were maybe a sentence, 2 sentences, or very vague. Or they didn't do all 3 things that were required for that answer. Maybe they just defined the term or explained who the person was, but didn't connect it to a piece of literature and didn't explain how that term is connected to that piece of literature. So on the final, you're going to want to make sure that you do all 3 of those things. That was written out on each question so that you could remember to do all 3 of those things for each one of those. Then there will be 3 essays, which are longer responses. They're not really essays, but they're 10 sentences long. You might be asked to compare aspects of 2 works, explain the qualities of literary periods, that kind of thing. So that's pretty much the structure of the exam. After that, I've put in some study materials for you. We finished the midterm and the 17th century with Paradise Lost. So this exam picks up from there in the 18th century with Gulliver's Travels. Obviously part 1, we didn't read the other parts of Gulliver's Travels, but you have some, go over the background material. Here is the slideshow that I used when I was introducing the 18th century, sort of like, you can find all that stuff in Blackboard, but I kind of like consolidated it down onto this document so that it's easier to study from it. Here are the terms and concepts that may pop up in the short answer or the essay section of the test. So I just went right into the test and I pulled out the terms that it will randomize for. So you could end up with any one of these items on your actual test. Then after that, you have links to the study guides and the video lectures on the different material for Gulliver. Then after that, same thing. It's the same setup for the Romantic period. Here are the terms you need to know because you could get any one of these. Here's the background information, study guides, lectures, all that stuff. Same thing, Victorian age with Ernest. Here are the concepts. Here are the lectures and the study guides. And then we have the modern era. Now, I haven't done any lectures on the modern era yet, or the 20th century. So those will go in and I'll put them in as we do them the next few days. But that's the study guide. Are there any questions about the exam or how to use this study guide to help you? All these terms are going to come from the PowerPoint from today and the points that I'll be making in the literature later this week and next week. So it's okay if these don't look familiar to you because we haven't gone over them yet. All right, that's available to you right here on in the unit. After that, in the unit, you have additional materials, like where I'll put the links to slideshows and other things that are pertinent, and also the video lectures that I will put in the links after I publish each class period. So all of the videos will be there. That's how the unit is set up. Talked about the final exam. Let's talk about discussion number 9 while I'm just here anyway. So discussion number 9 is about the importance of being earnest. That's the one that you'll do this week. So this question, this last discussion that you have to do, I bet you're going to have a little mental party when the discussions are over, is about comparing and contrasting the satire that we see in The Importance of Being Earnest. I spent time in class before we watched the different acts, talking about what was being satirized and so on. But I want you to compare and contrast that with the satire that we see in Gulliver's Travels. Also, there are a lot of notes about the satire from when we were talking about, part 1 of Gulliver's Travels. So what is different and what is similar about the way that Wilde and Swift go about making fun of society, making fun of different aspects of life during their time? I put a couple of ideas here for you. You can consider narrative techniques, their purposes for their satire, characters, themes, subject matter. What do these satires tell us about their surface versus their deeper values? So you should be, remember that compare contrast is not giving one thing and then giving the other thing, right? Like, so what I'm not expecting is that you will, or for a very good grade, that you will talk about the satire in Swift and then talk about the satire in Wilde. That's not comparing and contrasting. That's talking about two things. So comparing and contrasting means laying out one. Maybe you're going to start with The Importance of Being Earnest and talk about the satire in that, and then bring in the satire in Gulliver's Travels and bounce it off of the ideas that you were writing about regarding the satire in Importance of Being Earnest. So you have to mesh them. You have to say, this is similar, this is not similar. You have to draw all that out. Putting two things side by side is not compare and contrast. I can hold up these two pens and show them to you. Look, I have a blue one and I have a yellow one. But if I don't say, well, this is a ballpoint pen and this is a highlighter, this one has a different purpose. The purpose for this pen is to illuminate lines on the page, whereas this is more like to write in your own notes. Like, if I don't mesh them together and talk about their qualities as they overlap or they don't overlap, that's comparing and contrasting. If I just say, yep, here's a blue pen, here's a highlighter, you figure it out. That's not comparing and contrasting, right? So keep that in mind when you're working on discussion number 9. I want to give the best possible grades on the discussions. Most of the time, people do a great job. Lately, people have been losing points for not doing all of the replies to the classmates. But for the most part, the posts are usually in pretty good order. So questions on this last discussion? Before we get into the notes on 20th century literature? Okay. I'm going to, I put the PowerPoint here, or the slideshow. The slideshow that I'm going to go through right now is here under additional materials in the 20th century unit. So if you want to follow along or make your own copy, that's where you will find that slide deck. I do have the chat open, so if I'm talking about something and you have a question, then you can let me know. So the background, I was telling some people before everybody got here, the background that I've chosen for today is a depiction of World War I. I'll get out of the way for a second so you can see it there. As we move into the 20th century starts pretty quickly with World War I, and that war and its effects have a huge amount of influence on the 20th century literature. And we're moving into a period of great introspection and sadness, you know, because war tends to breed depression and sadness, and it causes extreme hardships for many people, especially a world war. So the depiction here is this, I think this is a Picasso, is this contemplative figure who's shrouded in gray. The background is sort of like seeping into him, and that I think is a good way to think about modernist writings. So 20th century literature focuses on the modernism movement, and the modernism movement is highly affected by the wars that were going on at the time. So let me go through the PowerPoint. You can take notes or whatever you need to there. So there are some historical considerations. We're talking about, you know, 20th century, obviously 1901, roughly to the present. We're sort of 20 years into the 21st century, but we're not far enough to say what are the qualities of 21st century literature yet. There are a lot of changes that happen moving from the 19th to the 20th century, and so the feeling is less secure. War tensions are rising in Europe, especially around the Balkans, in, you know, like Serbia, Bosnia, in those areas, and that's actually where World War I will start. The spark for World War I will begin there. And so there's this unsettling feeling throughout Europe that things aren't solid, that things are kind of touchy. There are doubts about economic, social, cultural norms. There are some new vocabularies. This is where we start to see work in the area of sociology, anthropology, psychology. Before this time, those things didn't exist. So the 20th century is where we really see, you know, the science of looking into human qualities and human disorders and things like that start to come into the forefront. There are a lot of changes in life, a big jump ahead with electricity. I mean, just imagine if in your lifetime you went from lighting candles every day and lamps to having electricity at your fingertips. That's a big jump. And in many ways, that's a convenience that is welcome. But it's also like the speed at which things are changing can be unsettling for people. I think we've seen that over the last year. The speed at which, you know, our normal life went from, you know, everyday behaviors to extremely different behaviors is unsettling and disruptive. And so people had conveniences like radio, pharmaceuticals, transportation, appliances, things like that in the 20th century, but the movement is speeding up. And for a lot of people, that is uncomfortable. You know, just ask your grandparents about technology and they'll explain that to you. It's the same idea, and it happens to all of us at some point in time, but there's a great, you know, influence of new technologies during this time, and that adds to that unsettling feeling for people. We have in the early 20th century, the women's right to vote passing in 1928. Remember, we're talking about Britain, so in the US it was a little bit earlier than that. I already mentioned that World War I is a factor in history at this time, obviously, because at the time that World War I broke out, a quarter of the world's population was under British rule in one way or another through colonialism, imperialism, all the isms. And so when World War I breaks out, it greatly affects Great Britain because of the number of different countries that are under protection um, of Britain. Colonialism is starting to shift away, and the British government is shifting away from colonialism in the sense that they're going to colonize places and turn them into British subjects like India and places in Africa, and giving way to more of a commonwealth where they help the area, but the areas make their own governments instead of British people coming in and ruling over them. After World War I, there is, just like in America, an economic depression. Many millions of people were killed in World War I. I think 16 million people died in World War I, including civilians. So that caused a huge disruption in factories and every kind of really walk of life that you can imagine. And so the 1930s brought an economic depression leading into World War II. So they had barely swept up from the damage of World War I, which was extreme. World War I brings on trench warfare. You've probably seen that in movies like Saving Private Ryan, or even Wonder Woman has an example of Wonder Woman. The first movie happens in during World War I. And so you can see that they dug trenches, and that trench warfare was extremely bloody and like horrific. World War II happens. They hadn't even really finished recovering from World War I. So there is, the benefit of winning those wars, but unlike America, there wasn't fighting on our shores. We didn't have battles going on in the middle of our country, but in Britain they did. So it's important to remember that their cities, their countryside was just riddled with disaster, bombs, and all kinds of, rubble everywhere. So they won, but lost the empire. And so all the colonies except Australia, Canada, a few countries in the Caribbean basically went back to their own rule. Britain could not sustain the empire as a whole because of the cost of the two wars together. Widespread immigration, people were rethinking what it means to be British because there was an influx of people coming to Britain and there were people leaving Britain. So there's like this revolving door of people who were coming to settle in the country and people who were leaving the country. And so the face of what it meant to be British was changing and being more, becoming more diverse. In the 1960s, if we move to sort of like the middle point of the 20th century, we can note the Troubles in Ireland. So the Troubles is what they call it, but it's really civil war. There's North Ireland and Ireland, and they battle over a united Ireland, but they don't want to be under British rule. And also there are religious differences between the different regions in Ireland. So there are a lot of skirmishes that happen during that Troubles. They don't call it an out and out war, but there's a lot of unrest in Ireland during the 1960s. All right, let's talk about characteristics of the 20th century literature. Now, of course, we have a much more diverse landscape of literature because we have people who are writing poetry, we have fiction, we have drama, and more people are writing. So as we get into the 20th century, poetry moves through a couple of different important movements, like Imagism. We're going to look at an Imagist poem on Thursday. It's in the selections. Imagism Imagist poems are very, very short, and they're just capturing like a little snapshot of a moment, like a door opening, you see what's in there, and then it's closing. So they're usually like 2 lines, 3 lines, Imagist poets are just about that little snippet. Postmodernism, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but postmodernism, if you click either of these, you can get more information on them. But postmodernism is just sort of like rebuilding after the effects of modernism, which is a kind of depressing outlook on life. And you can imagine why people had a depressing outlook on life because of the wars and because of, you know, the physical effect and also the mental effect that wars had on people. In fiction, in the early 20th century, we have modernism, and mid-century, we have realism. So the idea that we cannot know everything. And as humans, we want to know everything. And so we have this curiosity, but we have this struggle to know. So there's a philosophical element to fiction in mid-century. We're going to look at some mid-century poems. In the late 20th century, we have a much more diverse group of writers with fiction, a lot of different cultural voices because of the immigration that we were talking about at the middle to end of the 20th century. With drama, in the early 20th century, there's sort of writers that are challenging the idea that we should be complacent with our world because it's changing. Maybe we should change with it. What does it mean? What does it mean that now I have electricity in my house? You know, that seems simple to us, but it really changed a lot of things for people in the early 20th century. Mid 20th century was about minimalism, criticizing society. You know, up until the 50s, 60s, most of literature is, I guess you could characterize it kind of depressing. Late 20th century, talking about some legal reforms, talking about human rights, diversification. You can see that directly coming out of some of the even American movements that happened in the late 20th century, how we can equalize people in society. All right, here are some key authors of the 20th century. Virginia Woolf. We're going to read a short story by her called The Mark on the Wall. James Joyce, we read Araby first semester. So he's the author. We were supposed to read The Dead, which is from the same work that Araby comes from, but The Dead is about 40 pages. So I took that one out. But just if you want to remember the story Araby that we read, this is the writer for Araby. Yeats, we're going to read a piece by Yeats. Dylan Thomas, we're going to read Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Seamus Heaney, he's the one who translated Beowulf in our textbook, our version, but he was also a poet in his own right. And we're going to read his poem, Blackberry Picking. He just died in 2013, 2014. So he's more of a second half of the 20th century writer. Margaret Atwood, she's Canadian. So when we get into the 20th century, because of the Commonwealth, we start thinking about Canadians and also Australians and some of the Caribbean islands as part of the British literature, you know, legacy. So Margaret Atwood is Canadian. She wrote The Handmaid's Tale. They turned that into a series on Hulu, I think it is. She's the one that wrote that and various other things. She's still alive, she's still writing. Chinua Achebe is Nigerian. The same reason holds for them, you know, because he's Nigerian immigrant. So he wrote a novel called Things Fall Apart, which we are not going to read. Samuel Beckett is a playwright. So I just wanted to go through various major 20th century literary figures for you here. Are there any questions? Are there any slides that you want me to go back to? On Thursday, I will be spending some time talking about, if I go to the readings here, these 5 poems. So they're all quite short. So do have a look at them before class. I'll be bringing up the qualities of modernism and postmodernism that we see in these poems. I chose them so that they would demonstrate those qualities. You can read a little bit about modernism and postmodernism in the notes that they have here for you, but I'll also be touching on some of the qualities on Thursday with those poems. And then for Tuesday, we have, I think I might have those backwards. What do I have on the calendar? Yeah, so Virginia Woolf will be Tuesday, the mark on the wall. I think that's maybe 6 pages in the textbook. And then the garden party, that one's a little bit longer. Reminder that the essay number 2 is due next Tuesday. So hopefully you've had a good start at that. Are there any questions for today? Anything that you want me to spend a little time going over? Study guide questions? Anything like that? All right, then I will see you on Thursday for 20th century poetry, and we'll also, I'll take any questions that you might have on essay number 2 also on Thursday. That'll be the last class day that we have until the papers due. So that'll be a good day to, bring any questions that you might have, and I'll spend some time answering them on Thursday. All right, I hope you all have a good day. I will see you on Thursday. Bye.